Heading into conference championship week of this glorious college football season, man, it has been a roller coaster ride. Let's take a quick note of who's actually happy right now. I mean, Oregon is undefeated, so they're probably happy. Boise State is pretty much a shoo-in for the playoffs, with their only loss being to undefeated Oregon, so they're not mad. Notre Dame has been feeling all right in the back half of the season, but aside from that, I think we can all collectively sit back in our chair, rest our heads against the headrest and say, man, what the was that? So today, I just want us, as a shell-shocked college football loving community here on the Isaac Punch channel, to find the weirdest, most confusing losses of the season, and by weird, I mean genuinely strange to this day, not just the first team to realize that the team they were playing against didn't deserve the ranking that they had. Yeah, I'm looking at you, Georgia Tech. Beating a top 10 FSU was nothing to write home about this late in the season. I'm talking about the losses that might have seemed strange when they happened, but only got stranger as the season went on. But before I begin, I want you to see if you can guess the weirdest loss of the entire football season. So put it in the comments and then wait and see if you're right. I've got 4 big ones with a couple honorable mentions. We're going to start at number 4.
Gonna do it. The Georgia State Panthers have defeated Vanderbilt.
We have Georgia State knocking off Vanderbilt. Okay, now this seemed a little strange at first. Sure, the Panthers were 1-1, and we hadn't seen much out of them, but we know they're typically not a hot commodity, as they had already dropped one to Georgia Tech, and their opponent came into this game 2-0, but then through 60 minutes of game, it ended up being a close one, with Georgia State having the lead for better part of 3 quarters until Vandy eventually took the lead back. But with a little over a minute left in the game, some late game heroics happened to give State a 4-point lead with 15 seconds, where they would ride that to a victory. Now, usually a group of 5 team beating an SEC team would make the news, but this was Vandy, who are the GPA boosters of the SEC, so nobody really talked about it much. But looking back at what's transpired, with Vanderbilt taking on a highly ranked Missouri to overtime and almost beating them, knocking off number 1 ranked Alabama and arguably derailing their season as they never recovered from that loss, and honestly being really competitive with a number 5 ranked Texas team, showing that they were actually a surprisingly competent SEC team this year, while Georgia State would go on the slide of the century after losing 8 of their 9 following games. It just leaves you scratching your head. Maybe they just saw a chance to beat an SEC team and blew their load on that, but boy oh boy do these teams open up the most hilarious transitive wins. But coming in at number 3,
and this will be victory number 2 for Nebraska.
We have one I still think about to this day, and that is what the hell happened between Nebraska and Colorado. I mean, obviously Colorado was very hyped. They had Travis, they had Shedeur, they had Sanders' other son who nobody knows his first name, and they were taking on a literal Patrick Mahomes impersonator. Now, for those of you who don't keep up with Colorado last year, I mean, you would have had to be living under a rock, but they also had really high expectations and felt flat. And it felt like it was going to be one of those games from last season. Colorado got completely stifled for 4 quarters straight. They were completely smoked as Nebraska scored 28 points in the first half and pretty much rode that out until the only significant points for Colorado came in a garbage time touchdown to cut the lead to 18 points. And while even in the moment it was a bit strange because Nebraska didn't really look that good and Colorado had improved in a lot of their weaknesses from the prior year, it only looked weirder as the weeks passed. The Huskers turned out to be absolute bottom feeders in the Big Ten this year, as they had no notable wins aside from the one against Colorado, while on the flip side, the Buffalo turned into real conference contenders and had a ton of big wins and literally forced it to come down to tiebreakers where they just barely missed their conference championship. And what makes this one so weird is that it isn't just that they lost, it's how bad they lost. It's the fact that they lost by 18 points and got dominated by this Nebraska team that would literally not dominate anybody else for the rest of the season. It is just a strange one. And then the next matchup for the number 2 most confusing one. We've got to go with Arkansas Razorbacks taking on Oklahoma State. Now, this match on paper, the week that it happened, went how you'd expect, okay? Oklahoma was coming off of a very hot season. They're ranked at number 16, and Arkansas had no expectations, so were unranked. But it's an SEC versus Big 12 game, and you know what? Arkansas fought hard. They played one of the best Big 12 teams this year to the whistle, took them to overtime where a pair of missed field goals and a failed 4th down conversion by the Razorbacks was enough for a strong Big 12 team to just sneak out a win over what many assumed would be a middle-of-the-pack SEC team. And that's how people were prepared to talk about this game. But then Oklahoma State won their next game and never won again after that. That's right, they went on a 9-game slide to end their season by getting the brakes blown off of them in their final game against Deion's Colorado team. And this was supposed to be a quality loss for an SEC middle-of-the-pack team, showing that their mid-tier teams could hang with the best of other conferences, and instead turned into a random loss to an actual bottom feeder, while Arkansas once saw actually went through the upper ranks and reaped some havoc by knocking off Tennessee, but still ultimately fulfilling the expectation of being an occasionally competitive middle-of-the-pack team, leaving the result of this game to be quite the head-scratcher through the rest of the season. Now, before we get to number 1, I have a couple honorable mentions like I said. First, Stanford knocking off Syracuse early in the season, coupled with Cal knocking off Auburn. These ones kind of go hand in hand, and it was a time for people like me to flex that the Pac-12 was actually going to own the ACC and be really strong. But then Stanford and Cal literally ended up being in the bottom 5 ACC teams this year, with Cal giving Florida State their literal lone conference win and Stanford losing to everybody but, for whatever reason, Louisville, while Syracuse turned out to become a high-level contender in the ACC, and Auburn turning out to be, well, not good, but at least a decent SEC team that just had a really hard schedule, but knocked off the Aggies late in the season, leaving both of these losses to go down as just very confusing as we look back at them. And then the second honorable mention, or I guess third, is Georgia's 2 losses. Now, when they happened, they felt like they made some amount of sense. Like losing to Alabama, we all were like, okay, Alabama's the best team in the country again, and then they lost on the road to Ole Miss, and we were like, okay, that's a nasty 18-point loss on the road, but that's against a top 25 SEC school, so that makes sense. But now we look at those games, we're like, what the hell happened? Especially as they gave Texas quite the thumping at Texas and whooped Tennessee, who would later beat Alabama, but it just muddies the waters because both of the teams that Georgia lost to turned out to be just a little bit fraudulent, as Alabama now is a 3-loss team and Ole Miss had a really nasty loss later in the season as well. And these are supposed to be Georgia's high-quality losses, and now they're just kind of losses. But the top of the list, if you have been keeping up with college football this year, you should 100% know what's coming.
Mitch Jeter, and that's blocked at the line of scrimmage, and the Huskies are celebrating.
That's right, it's the NIU pulling off the upset of the year, maybe the best upset ever, and I'll get to that in a second, against Notre Dame. It is the Fighting Irish's home opener. They just went down to College Station and came away with a hard-fought win against the number 20 team in the country, and were ready to coast by while taking on a little MAC school in NIU. I made a whole video about how this went down, so you can go check that out if you want the full story, but we'll cut to the chase. It ends with NIU blocking the go-ahead field goal to win the game, and I think this might be the craziest upset of all time for one reason, okay? The last one that people talk about before this is Michigan losing to App State in 2007, and that's largely because Michigan was ranked at number 5, while App State wasn't even in the same division. They were still an FCS school. But in hindsight, as we look at the end of the season, we could tell that Michigan lost some more games and were clearly an overranked team, while App State went on to win the FCS National Championship quite handily. But this year, NIU got their emergency pity ranking with the hope that they turn out to actually be a powerhouse team, but no, they ended the season a completely middle-of-the-pack MAC team. But even more surprisingly than that, Notre Dame turned out to truly be one of the best teams in college football, as they dominated their schedule to end their regular season 11-1, where they easily make the playoffs and make this loss become one of the most unexplainable ones that I think I've ever seen. So let me know if you agree with this list at the bottom. I hope to read some of your comments, and peace.
The field, the game's not over. The referee, Jeff Heaser, telling the fans to get off.